everyone for joining me. I'm really glad to be here to talk to you about leadership principles. And to jump in, there's no better way to make sure that you hire the right people than to start with knowing what you value. And let me explain a little bit further. Not really referring to your personal values, although hopefully there's a large overlap. Rather, I'm referring to the values your organization prioritizes in their team, in which they believe have the highest chance to lead to success, however your organization defines that. Many companies call these leadership principles, and they can play a huge role in company culture by guiding the way people are hired and evaluated. But more than that, they can and should, and I really want to stress this, influence the way your organization approaches decision-making and opportunities and evaluates employees over time. And if everything aligns with your stated principles, lots of things will seem to magically fall into place. So let's talk a little bit more about that. In another webinar, we discussed behavioral-based interviewing techniques. And at a high level, the goals of this type of interview is to make sure your candidate's values and behaviors will align with that of the organization. I mean, after all, if an employee shares and practices your values, the chance of them being productive and happy with their work increases dramatically. Leadership principles just explicitly state what those behaviors are that support the values that you have. So let's assume your organization doesn't already have leadership principles in place, and most don't. How do you create them? Well, most organizations do have a charter or a mission statement, and that's a good place to start. So you can look in there to see what your organization says your goals are. And based on that, how are you going to be able to achieve them? So you can also then look at your top performers and think about, why are they successful? What makes them top performers? What traits do they have? What should be held up as ideals for the team? So these are really good ways to start to come to what are some of the attributes that will lead to the creation of leadership principles. And another thing you should do is ask this question. If everyone in your organization acted with these values, would it make us better? There's a simple test that you can give to yourself here. Leadership principles should apply to everyone at every level. They're short, they're realistic, they're easy to remember, and there aren't too many of them. Every time you add a leadership principle, it dilutes the others to some extent. So I tend to think that 6 to 10 are plenty, especially if you're just working to develop them. It's a lot easier to add to the list over time than it would be to take away. So be careful when you implement leadership principles to really be convicted that you have the right ones. So what are some examples? And here are some that Radar Talent Solutions developed to help one of our clients with their recruiting and candidate evaluation. And you can see that they start with very short, action-oriented statements like takes ownership. But that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So the next step is to develop a clear and concise definition of what that means within the organization so that nothing is left to interpretation. And obviously, the ones here, takes ownership and eagerness to learn, pass the test of applying to everyone in the organization. So once you have these in place, they can be used in a lot of different ways. And as we've already discussed, they make up the backbone of a behavioral interview process and a candidate evaluation. But even earlier in the recruiting process, the ones which will be a part of the interview should be highlighted in the skills and attributes section of the job description. Again, you're looking for alignment throughout the entire recruiting and employment life cycle. So starting by putting these in the job description is a great way to make sure that the applicants see what you value. And then when decisions are being made in the organization, leadership principles can be used to guide the process by asking yourself challenging questions like, would this decision be taking ownership? And then that can be used to help guide that decision-making process and debate. And then when formally and informally managing employee performance, the feedback given to employees should focus on their actions relative to those leadership principles. A good example of that is something like you see an employee take the initiative on something and you tell them after the fact that you thought they took great ownership in that situation. This is a great informal piece of feedback, but a more formal way that you can integrate leadership principles into your employee evaluation would be to talk about strengths and development areas relative to the leadership principles in the actual employee evaluations. Some companies go as far as to do 360 feedback, where they're asking other employees to provide feedback on what are the strongest and what areas of development are needed in terms of leadership principles for those that they work with. So if your organization can really commit to integrating leadership principles into your culture, they can make a huge difference in making sure your team is aligned on what's important. You'll get happier employees who perform better and stay around longer. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.